Hi, this is Game Design Thinking, and today I want to introduce you to a new series called Game Economies, where we are going to explore how influential game economies are to define the overall fun and engagement of a game, analyzing game economies from different perspectives and looking for untapped opportunities. The economy in game terms refers to how the resources interact with each other through players' input and the value of each resource relative to the player agency provided. In games, we usually have many resources at our disposal, some of them that we can easily relate to in real life, like money, gems, or terrain. But sometimes, games take the chance to make us think out of the box and utilize things that we don't normally think as resources. One of them is the one that we are going to discuss now. I am talking about corpses. Death is one of the most common mechanics in games. We usually take for granted that our characters will die many times during a play session. Even when there are games that treat death in a more mild manner, players still refer to the game mechanic as death, instead of being teletransported or disappearing from the game area. Many times, when the player character or an enemy dies, it leaves something behind, like weapons, coins, and sometimes their body. The body of an enemy usually doesn't bring any gameplay value. It is more a way for the player to feel a sense of progress by watching how the level has changed. But some game designers have seen that bodies can not only be a visual element that adds a sense of progress, but they can also add gameplay value and can be used as a resource, strange as it sounds. So, the first question that we need to address is what is a resource? In the broader sense, a resource is a source or supply from which a benefit is produced and that has some utility. Resources can be renewable and non-renewable, and they satisfy the needs of a system. From a game design point of view, we usually talk about resource management as the mechanic involving players establishing relative values for various types of resources, depending on the current state of the game. The game rules determine how players can increase, spend, or exchange their resources. Resources in games take many forms and shapes. Sometimes, resources have a physical representation in the game. For example, in Northgard, you can see the trees and the deers in the game map. These resources need to be processed to be usable for the player, who must send good cutters to cut the trees and convert them into wood, and hunters to kill the deers and convert them into food. Both wood and food don't have a physical representation in the game. They are just numbers in the system of the game and displayed through the user interface. Finally, there are information resources. That is, any information that can be relevant to an agent in the system. In many games, bodies of enemies give the information to other enemy agents that something is wrong and they will start to look for player's character, like what happens in games like Commando or Shadow Tactics. In both games, the player must hide corpses so enemy units don't spot them. Now, at the start of the video, I said that most corpses in games end up just as a visual representation with no gameplay value through the rules. This is a classical example of a linear economy, where resources enter the system and then they leave it, with no chance for the resource to have value again. This has led to many problems in real life, like the amount of garbage generated by products in disuse, which parts can be used again to build related products. But that is a discussion that we are going to have in a future video. In games, linear economies generate other kinds of problems. To start, more resources in games are represented just as a number, so there is no problem to just make them disappear. In fact, it is easier than to reuse them. Maybe that is the reason why many games display a linear economy, where resources are just destroyed and they effectively exit the system, without any chance for that resource to add value to another system, generating disconnection between different resources and systems, and in many cases, generating more complexity than needed, because another type of resource must be added to solve a gameplay problem that an outgoing resource can solve. In contrast, a circular economy reintroduces used and discarded resources to the system, adding value to different parts of the development stage for that or other resources. Regarding the main concern of this video, some games have made use of corpses as a resource. For example, in Downwell, and I know, in every video I have ever made, I have talked about Downwell, but it is such an elegant game that it is useful to exemplify many characteristics of games. If you haven't seen any of my other videos, you can find them in the card that will appear now at the top of the screen. So, in Downwell, when the player kills an enemy, some of them, depending on their type, will leave a body behind that will disappear after a few seconds. These bodies haven't any gameplay value per se, but some upgrades use the corpses to make them explode when the player chews them or to eat them and recover some amount of health. These bodies haven't any gameplay value per se, but some upgrades use the corpses to make them explode when the player shoots them or to eat them and recover some amount of health. There are more games that explore corpses as a valuable resource. In Warcraft 3, many game units leave a corpse behind when they die. The undeads can make some use of these bodies, for example, using meat wagons to throw corpses to enemy units and infect them, or pick up bodies and place them into the battle and use necromancers to convert these corpses into skeletal warriors. Also, one of the most interesting uses of corpses in a recent game is what designers did in Frostpunk. In the early stages of the game, the player can choose to dispose of the bodies in two different forms. Creating a cemetery makes bodies exit the system for good, but if players choose to build a snow pit, this can be used as a resource, like use the bodies for transplants or as a fertilizer. This gives the decision to the player into taking a morally correct and accepted way to dispose of the bodies in terms of the society displayed in the game, or to use the bodies as a strategic resource if things get complicated. Finally, one of the most interesting decisions that are hidden from the main mechanics of the game is the option to sign a law called Alternative Food Source, in which, if things get to a desperate level, citizens will start to eat dead bodies, and, if the player chooses so, instead of punishing them, can sign a law to convert corpses into 15 units of raw food. These games use corpses as a valuable resource for players, giving them opportunities to use a broader set of mechanics. But there are also games that use corpses as a taxation tool. This is, making the player pay something for killing an enemy. One case in point is from Darkest Dungeon. When the player kills an enemy unit, this leaves its body placed in the same place that it occupied when it was alive. This effectively adds more life to the enemy, but stopping its ability to attack or dodge or anything else. This adds more difficulties for the player, because some characters can attack only at certain positions, and if the player doesn't make a good strategy, they will have to lose their attacks trying to destroy a corpse that is not threatening in any way other than restricting the player's ability to attack other enemies. Now, these examples open up opportunities to use corpses as a resource in different shapes. You can use corpses as an effective resource that adds some value for players when a unit dies, deciding not to remove the resource of the system and instead using it as a gameplay resource, or even make something happen when a resource is leaving the system. That can be used to increase players' control and effectiveness of use of the system. But you can also use them as a taxation resource, creating friction for the player using the system. For example, one missing opportunity in strategy games or games that count dead bodies for the tens and hundreds is to use corpses to restrict unit movement. For example, in games like Ancestor, Legacy or Total War, the amount of units that die are high, so one of the uses could be to slow down the movement of units passing by a certain accumulation of corpses. So players can use this as a strategic use of the terrain to slow down enemy units and attack them with ranged units. Or even, corpses can block certain parts of the terrain, taking for example the Battle of the Bastards in the HBO series Game of Thrones, and how the amount of dead bodies is blocking the movement of the troops. There are many other opportunities to use corpses as resources and taxation elements for players. Also, corpses can display more information besides just a body lying on the ground for other enemies to encounter. For example, in stealth games, enemies can have sensitive information about patrols, security systems, and more. It is interesting to explore game economies in game design and understand that things that we don't usually think as a resource in real life can be used as part of the game economy. And that's why I decided to start this series with this specific analysis. I hope that you liked it, and remember to like and subscribe for more content about game design and how to create more fun, engaging, and meaningful games. Thanks for watching.